under the NEC, Section 6 dealing with compensation rents really draws together lots of other threads from around about the rest of the contract, whether that's early warnings or the accepted programme or various other processes. Do you think, Ewan, that drawing together of other processes which really have a different primary purpose but are now being used in a secondary way almost for compensation rents, does that really work?
Well, it works if all those primary reasons have worked as well. So, I mean, it's quite an extensive list. If you think about a issue that was subject to an early warning, that there was a risk reduction meeting that might have developed into a compensation event, you then have a notice, you then have quotations submitted, you have an assessment of that based upon the accepted programme, which is subject to another set of provisions. So there's an awful lot that could come undone along the way, or perhaps if one of the other parties is not being agreeable, there's a lot to potentially disagree with them, and probably the most significant of which is the lack of an accepted programme. So in answer to your question, it works if everything else works, but if any other of those other parts come tumbling down, shall we say, then the compensation event procedure is also going to be affected.
So I think, John, what Ewan's describing, if you put it in my language, is it's everything in one basket. So either all works and it's all great, fabulous, and that's how the contract's drafted on that assumption, or you pull one thread and stop it working and the whole thing falls to pieces. Do you think that's right? And if that is where you end up, how do you deal with it?
That either-or position is a bit black and white, bit too stark. I certainly think it's true that if the programme isn't working properly, then that will have impacts throughout the rest of the project. So you go to the early warning procedure. Well, what impact does this have? Well, I don't know. Looking at the programme, or well, what's the impact when we come to assessing the compensation? Well, we haven't got an up-to-date programme, or we haven't, whatever it is. It's going to affect it. It's going to hinder it. But I still think the processes can work, but just not as well.
Mm-hmm. And when it doesn't work as well, Ian, I guess, that's where you tend to get into more disagreement, you tend to incur additional cost as you stop producing the works and look at self-justification for your actions rather than being positive. That can't be a good thing, can it?
No, absolutely. I mean, the contract presupposes that people do what is required underneath it. Unlike other forms of contract that say, when someone doesn't do something, here's what happens next. The contract assumes that there is an accepted programme in place. Okay, there's some ways around that in terms of project manager assessments, but at the same time, there's an expectation that people are doing what is required. They are complying with timescales, they are submitting the documentation, putting quotations in. So if that isn't happening, then suddenly you're going to lose the contract, or you start to move away from the benefits of it, and it's a lot of effort to pull yourself back on track. So you've got to try and avoid that at all costs.
And talking about avoiding at all costs, because you end up in a situation where you're not really under an NEC anymore. If you haven't actually adopted and used the mechanisms in there, you're under this sort of unknown thing that started off as being an NEC, but now is something different, and that just creates a huge amount of risk and uncertainty, doesn't it, John? And then no one benefits from that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you could say there's more risk in that sense under the NEC, because as Ian said, the NEC presumes that you do that stuff, whereas other contracts presume that you're not going to do it, and you have a big bun fight at the end, and the rules are relatively clear cut about what that big bun fight, how that's conducted, whereas the NEC is very clear about how you manage the contract as it goes along, but not so clear about what happens if you haven't done that.
I think, in fairness, with other contract forms, your FIDICs, your JCTs, there's also an expectation that the main processes will be operated, and it doesn't, they doesn't necessarily have things when, if a claim situation occurs, here's how you deal with that particular claim. I think you're right that we're both agreeing that the NEC is more proactive rather than reactive. But if you don't apply any contractual provisions under any contract, what are you working to? Yeah. How are you going to sort it out later?
I was being a bit black and white there. Yeah.
Interestingly, I mean, just it is under the compensation event procedure that you have the three deeming provisions under NEC.
Yes, true.
So, and they are the only three deeming features. So interestingly, they apply the compensation event procedure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that I find most interesting is whilst we sort of talk about the NEC making assumptions about how the process will have worked and you know, the JCT and FIDIC having something similar, the key difference between them for me is that the NEC rolls all the processes together in a single continuous stream. So if there's a breakdown at any point, you've got a problem. Whereas with the JCT, for example, and FIDIC equally, I think, you can take each clause and each obligation in isolation on its own, and if you fail on that, it doesn't actually impact on the next thing in the line, because they're all self-standing obligations with self-standing processes within them. And I think that for me is the key difference.
Yeah, I think there is links in some of those contracts as well. Again, I think it can be quite so clear cut in that there's a lot of cross-referencing in those contracts where one clause links into another clause, that you may get a clause that entitles you to raise a claim, then other clauses on how that claim can be advanced and how the time would be assessed, or if it led to a variation, how the cost would be assessed. So there are linkages. So, you know, I think you're absolutely right that it's not as combined, it's not a single rolling process, but at the same time, again, if you fail to do one thing, it may impact upon other aspects of a FIDIC or a JCT.
So wrapping that up and summarising that conversation, I suppose the key that we're talking about here is that, yes, the Section 6 of the NEC does wrap up a lot of other process, but actually that can be a beneficial thing because you do get continuity of the processes, and you know what you put in, you get out at the other end through the compensation. You don't get this sort of disjoint. But you do have to be careful to make sure that you operate those processes consistently throughout, because if you don't, you can quite quickly become unstuck. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.